be bitchy and take it myself. And the reason I'm going to take it myself is two things have been missing from this whole conference so far, which is a little upsetting to me. The first thing is the market for data. We're not talking about the economics here. And that really worries me, the opacity of the market for data. Okay? And who does that give power to, adding to information asymmetries? That's thing one. And sorry, I'd like you to comment on that. The other thing is that there are no rules governing the mixing of data. There are rules governing proprietary data, right? There are rules governing public data at the national level, right? And certainly many countries now have personal data protection laws. Who knows how well they're enforced? But what we don't have rules in an opaque market is regarding the mixing of data. And we have to talk about that because that requires really good governance skills, right? To be able to govern all those different types of data as well as the mixing. And there isn't a country on the planet that yet really has rules governing that. And that is the future of smart cities, as Dr. Scassa, wherever she is, can talk about. Somewhere here. Do you want to comment?
Sure. Just let me know if I need to adjust. So to your first point on the market for data, I think I actually view that the market for data is here, but it still is forming. So I think that there are a lot of questions. I was really pleased to hear some of the initiatives that Stefaan spoke to because I think there is demand, even in the short time since I've joined the lab in the last 5 years, the questions that I'm hearing from my colleagues have changed dramatically. There were no questions before, or it was viewed as, oh, technology is a different thing, we sprinkle there. The questions are coming fast and furious now, and people are thinking about it in their day-to-day work, which is exactly the way we should think about it. Of how do we operate and change the models that we may have used and relied a decade ago. I think beyond the internal movement of the agency, which can be sometimes cautious, I've been encouraged to see that the market has expanded to our partner country governments, that they're understanding that they have risks to deal with, and they have responsibilities to their citizens to answer those. And I think finally we've seen it expand to what I'm hoping to see growth in is that market starts to spread more to the public. We may have seen it, certainly there's a lot of demand in the US, but I think there are a lot of countries where data, and it was alluded to already, that the value of personal data, there is no understanding that we are giving away our rights. We are just signing and saying, well, I want to use this app, so I'm not going to read the privacy terms. Or perhaps those who are coming online for the first time through mobile phones, they don't even understand the legalese that's being used. And so I think there is work, the market is there, but there is work to be done by government and civil society to help educate that and develop that market. On the rules on the mixing of data, I think that's a really interesting question. I admit I'm probably guilty of focusing on just the basic rules of what are the rules around formal data rather than looking forward to the mixing of it. I almost wonder if it's less about the rules of mixing data as much as the processes that we should think of. I think oftentimes we get focused a lot on the answer, and that happens a lot in policy discussions of, well, what should we do? What is the right answer? And I think often in terms of data and emerging technology, there are no easy right answers, or if there are, they will change very quickly. And so if we think about the mixing of data, what does that look like? Are there standards? Are there processes for building capacities, sustaining the use, questioning if there are issues of quality? Those might need to come before we can fully set the rules.
Great. Well, Susan, always the hardest questions. Well, on the first one with regard to markets, it's kind of interesting, and I think the question is, can we consider it as a separate market, or is it part of other markets, right? And so, like for instance, we did at a certain point in time, we did an initiative which was called the Open Data 500, right? And so here we try to understand the 500 corporations in the US that were using open data for their purpose. And then what we actually did, which we never published, was trying to understand, are those companies, right, do they see themselves as a sector on their own, right? The open data sector that is using open data thing. And it turns out that they were not connected at all with each other, which means that they don't see themselves as a open data company. They see themselves as a health company that is using open data. They see themselves as an energy company using open data. And so talking about, anyway, the market of data, I think there are different sectors, right? You have the health sector, you have, anyway, you name education sector, and within those sectors, there's demand for data, and the sectors could be transformed using data. And I think it's not going to be a distinctive market, right? It's going to be different markets within different sectors that actually have a need for addressing or for having access to the data. That's one way to think about it, is that, anyway, sometimes we think about that data is actually going to be the defining tool to have a sector identify themselves, and that's only a slice, which are then people that are in the business of selling data. But I think most others are actually already in existing sectors and markets, and that's where the transformation will happen the most. And I don't know whether that creates more confusion.
No, it doesn't. I think, just to push you guys a little bit harder, the market in general, right, is opaque. We don't know supply, demand, price.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not a black market, but it's like corruption. So the only way to address that market is governance counterweights, right? But we don't have governance counterweights. And if Dr. Scassa was, I don't know where there she is! Could you just 2 minutes talk about smart city and the mixing of data and who owns that data and the implications? Put you on the spot, sorry.
Well, yeah, the smart cities context is interesting, and I would distinguish between two different types of context. One is just the ordinary urban environment where cities are adopting different technologies, and there's not a lot of thought given to data governance or sharing, and contracts procurement tends to happen on a one-off basis, and that's fairly that's not very well thought through. The other context is the kind of smart city development that I've been tracking in the in the case of Sidewalk Toronto, which some people may have heard of. It's Sidewalk Labs is an alphabet company that is proposing this smart city development in the city of Toronto, which is going to integrate digital technologies from the ground up. And there have been a lot of debates about who's going to have access to that data, which also includes questions about who actually has an interest in that data and what that interest entitles them to in terms of participation in decisions about what's appropriate data to be collecting, in what ways, what are appropriate uses, with whom should the data be shared, and for what purposes. And so there's obviously a private sector interest. There's a public sector interest. Beyond the public sector interest, there's also a sense of a communal interest that might be different from the public sector interest. And I think there's some interesting tensions there as between whether the municipality or a provincial or government represents the public in terms of their communal interest, or whether there's the sort of public interest in managing the economy and all of these sort of higher level things, and then there's a communal interest in deciding what's right for the particular community and how is that interest represented. And then of course there may be individual interests around privacy. So then the data governance conversations become quite complex in that context. I don't know, there's 2 minutes and I don't know if that covers what you want, Susan, but
Yeah, that's
throw
good.
that out there.
Well, so the question, I mean,
The developing
we use also demand, supply and so on, and sometimes we get criticized for using market terminology. That this is actually more about an ecosystem. And so the question then is, of course, what's the ecosystem for data that would be healthy, depending on what the objectives might be. And there are multiple players within that ecosystem that have a distinctive role, right? And some of them, anyway, are those that actually have the capabilities to generate insight, which might not be the same one as the ones that have the data, right? And so there's a whole, I think we need to do a much better job in actually ecosystem mapping, for instance, that creates for those kinds of healthy data ecosystems that allow for positive value to be generated. Having said that, we do and it will be interesting to see how the World Bank is going to advance that. We do need far better methodologies for valuation of data, meaning that the whole data valuation methodology space has not advanced that well. There are only a few papers out there that actually have really tried to push the boundaries to understand what is the economic value, for instance, and other types of value, and how do we even start measuring what that might look like. And I think that's, anyway, as the field progresses, I think that's also where then the methodology might evolve and progress as well, to really understand what is actually the value, and then also to then try to understand what are the opportunity costs, for instance, if you don't start leveraging some of those data assets.
Do you want to add?
Absolutely. Sure, maybe just building off of the ecosystem point, I think is an excellent one. There is a tendency to think about the governance models, which is absolutely critical. I think we often try to bring out the human component too of there is the enabling environment that is built to support good governance and infrastructure. There is also that market building that has to make sure that there are governments and an enabled workforce and citizenry that is able to ask the questions and to push back and raise issues that are important to them and translate that into what that means for day-to-day life.
Perfect. Who has a question? Jennifer.
I can just
Here it comes.
speak loudly. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So my question is for you. Jennifer Brinkerhoff. I'm on the faculty here at the Elliott School. My question is for Dr. Verhulst, and it kind of builds on Susan's question. So I get that you're talking about supply and demand and the language of markets. You described in your 100 questions project migration as an example. And so my question is, what happened to those questions that you generated from that? And this gets to the market. So now that you have these questions, who is going to champion those questions and ensure that the data is collected and made available and used for the insights, et cetera? Thanks.
Yeah, good question. And so, so we designed the 100 questions in a manner that we only start domains when we actually have an actor or a partner that is also committed to then turn the questions into data collaboratives. So, so here we have, as it relates to migration, we have IOM and the European Commission that were our partners and are our partners. And so last week at the International Forum for Migration Statistics in Cairo, we actually launched the 10 questions, right? And then we had a conversation with the larger community there on how do we then turn this into action. And so what we have at the moment is also a public voting exercise that then, anyway, can rank the 10 questions. And ultimately, the idea here is to combine epistemic communities with the public in order to then crystallize the demand. And what we're going to test is that if you have a better demand, does then that also lead to more appetite among those data holders to actually collaborate? Because what we hear from the private sector quite often is that they get inundated now with certain private sector. They get inundated with questions and they cannot figure out what is the question that matters that they actually should invest and select. And so what we've tried to do is the work for them to actually say, if we have a better demand, then it will be easier for you to actually prioritize what you want to work on. And so that's the whole idea. I cannot guarantee that every question will turn into a data collaborative, but several already have indicated that now they actually have a clear signal. And they can also now start realizing whether their data can actually help, right? Because they also get questions all the time, and it turns out, anyway, most of those questions cannot be answered by the data they have, right? And so we need to also become smarter about the matching to a large extent.
We have a question in the back.
Paul from USAID. So I think this question is more for Susan and Stefaan. On governance, it's kind of a mammoth challenge given the complexities that folks have spoken about today. And one thing that I think about when we start to unwrap the challenges around approaching governance of this issue is data as a foreground issue for certain companies. So there you could think of so-called data brokers, AI firms, data analytics firms, those kinds of entities. And then data as a background issue or companies that are in the health sector, in agriculture and so forth. And in those cases, there usually is some sort of a regulatory environment that those companies have to abide by. And the question there is, I think a lot of times people have focused on governance in this context more on the AI type companies, data brokers. And my question is, do you have any thoughts on how to effectively leverage or adapt or extend the existing regulatory frameworks that are in specific sectors so that they cover appropriately data issues in those sectors, as opposed to attempting to have a single data regulatory environment framework to rule them all, so to speak?
Yeah, well, it's an ongoing discussion on do you need vertical versus horizontal or sector-specific versus society-wide kind of governance structures. And I think you probably need both depending on what we are talking about. But I think what is the real, anyway, typically, of course, I think the first challenge quite often is talking about data governance quite often for countries that don't even have rule of law, right? And so that would be like anyway, priority number one, that you actually do have a rule of law environment that then can allow for instance, more accountable kind of practices. But then it's quite often about, anyway, are there sector-specific needs? Now, from my point of view, what we are working on is actually not only having rules, but also understanding who actually is the decision maker and who should be accountable within organizations with regard to data, for instance, because that's quite often not sure as well. And so we are developing this concept of decision provenance. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about data provenance, but frankly, we quite often have no idea who actually makes decisions within organizations, under what framework, what are the rationales that goes into the decision making, and ultimately what then has the impact down the line. Because data is not a thing, right? It's a process. Decisions are made at the collection stage, decisions are made at the processing stage, decisions are made at the sharing stage, and so on and so on. And so how do we actually become smarter about how all those decisions add up? And how do we get transparency with regard to who makes those decisions, under what rationales, and what are then the governance structures that should apply across those decision makers as well? And I think that's something that, again, we need far more progress on, and that could be sector specific, because in some sectors, those decision makers would already be covered by some kind of professional accountability mechanisms. And then understanding what is the professional accountability, is it a code of conduct that they already are using to make decisions, and that also then can be applied to data, for instance. Right. Again, a long-winded answer to your question.
I think I would just make a comment that I tend to agree that there is wisdom in looking at a sector view, but that we have to take care that sector-specific does not become sector siloed. So I think that the right answer is probably around that. You do need both. There should be some common framework that ensures that not everyone is rebuilding policy from the ground up. But I would hope that it's not only at that common framework level, but also that it continues to make sure that as you implement that policy or as the governance plays out, that there is use of data and sharing of insights across sectors as well, which I think we tend not to see even as we're working at a country level. We may be working with a forward-thinking Ministry of Health, but the Ministry of Agriculture is having completely separate conversations with a completely separate donor, and they are asking questions about zoonotic disease or something that has very crucial elements that reside in both sectors. And so perhaps efforts such as the data stewards, those kinds of roles and positions would be an important part to consider too.
Thank you. Thomas, do you have a question from the web?
Yeah, we have an online question from Jess Ya. This is for Stefaan. You spoke on the potential for data collaboratives in the migration field. What are some of the concrete potentialities and challenges of using data in displacement?
All right. Well, I would. Well, how to answer that question? Well, first of all, I would say, I would recommend the person to go to the 100questions.org and see what are the 10 questions that were selected. Some of them were related with displacement as such. And again, to a large extent, it's about what I started with my presentation. It's about, can we create insight that can help decision making with regard to migration? And so when it comes to displacement, for instance, anyway, the value would be is that we become more smarter, for instance, about the impact of displacements on families, for instance, or that we become smarter of the impact of climate change on displacement. And there's a whole range of questions here that we can explore in order to really advance and improve our policies, but also approaches to displacement, but also sometimes, again, at the individual level, where, anyway, data can help those that are displaced make better decisions, for instance, on where to go and how to go about things.
You want to add anything? Okay, we had some questions over here. Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Naoto Kanehira from the World Bank. I found Suzanne's question, the two questions, very interesting, so wanted to push a bit more on that front. The rule on mixing data and the data market. There was some recent survey research on the cost of separating data. So before mixing data, you have to separate and then privacy, security sensitive data from publicly shareable data, and then mixing it. And I think this applies to both private and public sectors. And the survey asked how costly is separating data to your firm or to your agency, and predominant answer is extremely prohibitively high. So do we call it as a market failure against the societal return on investing in kind of improving, lowering the cost of the data ecosystem to enable mixing the data and lowering the cost of separating data? And then is there a rationale for public sector's intervention, or in case of international development, what donors should be thinking about this? So, and then in context of, so EU has GDPR, countries even like India, Kenya enacting the localization requirements. So this is fairly complex issue. So I wanted to turn this question on, do we have interesting examples or reflections that kind of helps us advance on our thinking around, the collective improvement of the data ecosystem in context of the development?
Yeah, it's an okay. So staying with the market paradigm, right? And I think typically the question then is, and I kind of anyway like your question: are we witnessing a market failure, right? And then the question is, a market failure in what market, right? And so what we have looked into, is there a market failure with regard to private data being shared with public sector, for instance, so that actually, anyway, there's a more distributed access to data, and I think it's unclear, right? And I'm a member of the so the European Commission created an expert group, which is called the Expert Group on Business to Government Data Share, and so I'm on that expert group. And so for the last year, in 2019. We've been discussing the market failure question, and we still haven't figured it out, because to a large extent, and it could be a market failure, right? Because part of the reason why it would be a failure is because the market is not transparent, right? And that's what we are witnessing at the moment. Going back to anyway, even answering the question of market, we actually don't know who has what data, right? And as a result, we might have a market failure because of lack of transparency of the market players and actually what is the market as such, right? And so that's like one way to answer that, and I'm sure economists in the room will have other reasons why they might call it a market failure, but I think creating, and coming back to then your last question on how do we create a better ecosystem, would be by starting more transparency of actually the ecosystem of where is the supply, right? Transparency with regard to who could use the supply if we figure out reuse of that supply, and then also transparency with regard to how are we going to measure progress. And I think at the moment, quite often we don't have that level of transparency.
I hesitated to speak to market failure in a room full of economists, but I definitely think that there is a strong role for public sector. Oh, so sorry. I definitely think there's a role for public sector. Something that I've been curious to follow is the California Consumer Protection Act, and I think it's a good demonstration of how, speaking to the information asymmetries that Stefaan was alluding to, it's attempting to flip the model of who holds that data and the inherent value that I don't think consumers are quite aware of. And so by placing the default rights in the hands of the consumers, that will hopefully help to turn the market model that is currently in place. And I think the second piece is in thinking about the definition. So that question of public and private data, do we even have a firm definition on what is public versus private data? I think the answer to that is no. We've seen it change just even between the GDPR and the CCPA. That definition of private data has expanded significantly, and you see companies that are scrambling to react accordingly. So I think that setting those definitions and defining the value to protect consumers and citizens is two of the important roles that public sector can play.
I'd love to comment, but I won't. Yes, Bob. And I'm sorry, Sharada, you're next.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Hi, I'm Bob Fay. I work for the Center for International Governance Innovation, and Susan is one of our great fellows who provides a lot of our research output. I want to comment on the point about the market for data. So there is one market that's in operation right now and on everyone's phone and every time they go into social media, which is a well-developed market for data. And that's the online auction system that takes place with personal data with the social media platforms. And so the question is, it's a very well-developed market. Your data are being used and valued, every minute you use the platforms. But the governance around the use of that data is very opaque or completely non-existent. And in fact, I went onto Google under privacy to find out what was going on with my data, and I found out I have 139 companies following me and targeting me, and I don't think I ever agreed to any one of those. So this is more of a comment. So where I work, we're looking at the platform governance issues, and they basically span a lot of the work that we've heard this morning, and there's much more profound work to be done. But some of Susan's work points out that in fact there really is no comprehensive governance strategy around data anywhere. Now another point on valuing data. So our statistical agency has in fact put out experimental estimates on Canada, the value of data. And they've used a tried and true approach that statistical agencies have used in the past for other things. But I think what's striking is that the value of Canadian data, according to their estimates, is about 2/3 the value of our oil assets. And so from a Canadian perspective, that's enormous. And I would suspect that given the methodology they've used, it's an underestimate. But there are methodologies out there that can, that at least can be built upon. And I think what StatCan has done is a very good start. Okay, those are my comments.
Yeah, I agree with that, and thanks for yes, the Canadian study was actually one of the better ones that are out there. There are also studies with regard to value within sectors. So like there's some study about the value of reuse of data in the healthcare sector. So there are a few of those, but I think generically we need to advance those as well. And I think coming back to the ultimate discussion that you started, governance. I think we're talking about the governance of reuse of data, which is why I'm trying to emphasize that. I mean, we do have governance of the collection of data, right? But we don't have governance of the reuse of data, right? And even GDPR doesn't really address secondary use to a large extent. They address collection and what purpose you can use it for. But then how do you govern reuse? The assumption is if you have covered everything, then reuse is fine, right? And so, and frankly, there's a lot of confusion among the research community whether they can actually reuse data. And so there's a total lack of clarity about reuse of data. And I think if we could make progress on that front, we would actually be all better off to a large extent. And also, perhaps instigate certain kinds of rights, but also which is then going back to the value, understanding what is the opportunity cost if we don't reuse data, right? Because there are, anyway, also opportunity costs if you don't reuse data that we need to become more smarter about, so that we actually really can balance and understand the cost and the value and the benefit.
Do you want to add anything? It is pretty shocking how little literature there is on the economics of data. It's truly shocking. Well, actually, Shada was waiting.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Okay, we're going to take 2 questions. Well, we have 5 minutes, so we're trying to be on time. Hi.
There's somebody in the line.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Erica Basu. I'm from the American University, just completed the doctoral program there. I just wanted to make 2 comments, really. One, I don't know who said this. It's often been quoted that Mark Twain said it about lies, damned lies, and statistics. And I have a feeling that this could very well apply to discussions about data as well, because data has been used, misused, abused in different ways. So it's very easy to fall into the trope of data as truth, and I think we should be quite careful when we are talking about this, especially with development issues. My question really is, because of this reliance that we place on data to kind of drive, help us understand, analyze, gain insights, are we going back again in terms of a development paradigm to this top-down development paradigm where the information resides with the so-called experts and we take agency away from the people that we are supposedly trying to help? So as we're discussing these, I think that may be something we should kind of keep in mind. Are we moving back in time to a model that's top-down rather than this very participatory model of development that has been so espoused?
Okay, we're going to take one more question, and they're going to answer them together.
Susan, we have a question right
Okay.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Carla Yee. I come from the Inter-American Development Bank, and I have 2 quick questions. The first one is about talent retention for the national statistical offices. How can national statistical offices and in general offices that produce official data can promote skills development but also help retain talent, because all the data skills are very in demand in the private sector? So how to motivate and help your employees and really give them a sense of purpose of the work they're doing? That's the first comment. And the second is that we're also very concerned and interested in producing more research about the value of data. And we recently published a paper about how much it costs not to make a census every 10 years and not to have accurate population estimates. And we found out that, we studied different countries in Latin America, and we found that the cost of not having accurate population data and therefore not having efficient allocation of intergovernmental transfers cost over 20 times the cost of the budget for the National Statistical Office. So I will be very happy to share with you the paper, and we would love to have feedback because we really want to keep producing research on this line. Thank you.
That's great. I think those 2 questions were paired so perfectly. I feel like they build on one another, so it's wonderful to have those. I think that part of that realization of building the value of data and driving incentive for governments to invest more is part of the answer to retain talent, because it's definitely an issue of how do you keep knowing that there is a commercially driven private sector that is able to lure away talent more effectively. I think a big part of it is presenting that cost. I think that also can lead to, at times, a few steps back in terms of how are we focusing, or how are we building our development models? Are we working in tandem with partners? I think at USAID we are trying to learn from that, and there can be the tendency to say, well, we need to have the answers first, and are we upskilling our internal staff? But the many efforts I wasn't able to cover, we are working on all those fronts. So within the Global Development Lab, we're working a lot with our country government partners and looking at the programmatic side. But there are other parts of the agency that are, for example, executing on federal legislation governing data use. Our Office of the CIO, I think I heard there was a colleague from the data services team. They're looking at a comprehensive effort within the agency to build data literacy and data skills within the current USA workforce. And those are two components of that upskilling. Is on the one hand, you want to bring in the talent that may not exist. And we've seen creation of, just at a basic level, job descriptions for data scientists across the federal government. That's a huge step in terms of being able to put language to the demand. But at the same time, you have to look at how you upskill your current staff so that you're able to work this into the fabric of the agency, so to speak. And then on the policy end, we are not waiting until we have all of the answers to data governance and technology governance, but we are restructuring the ways in which we build our country-level strategies, for example, accompanying the journey to self-reliance with country roadmaps that build off of 17 different metrics that are pulled from external institutions to build a picture of what does the progress towards self-reliance in terms of political commitment and capability in a certain country look like in achieving development goals. The purpose of that is not necessarily to say we have a scorecard or we have the answers. Again, it's to start a conversation around data with country governments and to go with them on that journey to understand, so what does this mean about the next decade of your development goals, and how does USAID support that?
Well, very briefly, I mean, this is a hard problem, of course, across public officials, right? So how do we, anyway, attract people that are willing to work within the public sector? But as it relates to data, just a few observations. One, it's very interesting that, so we also studied what are the incentives for corporations to actually engage around their data and to provide functional access. And it turns out one of the incentives is to actually retain talent. Because it turns out that many of data scientists working in certain kinds of corporations actually really don't like optimizing advertising all the time, right? They actually would like to use their talents to also make a difference in society. And that's then the reason why companies have figured out, if you start working with some organizations that try to do good, then actually it's a way to retain the talent. And so the question is, can statistical agencies position themselves as the place to actually do good, as opposed to going to companies to optimize advertising? That's one. And two, if you really want to retain data scientists, you need data. And so one way to actually also retain data scientists is to actually provide access to different types of data sets that might reside in actually the private sector. And so even thinking about innovation mechanisms within statistical agencies where you actually collaborate with others that have different types of data might be a way to actually also attract certain kinds of talent that you otherwise would not have. And so that's one way to think about it. And then the question about top-down, bottom-up, it's complicated, right? Because to a large extent, the fact that an individual at the moment, through availability of data, mainly open data, knows when the bus comes, for instance, right, is tremendously empowering, especially, for instance, if you're operating in an environment where it's not safe, right? And so knowing exactly when the bus comes up is an empowerment through data, for instance, and you have multiple other kinds of examples, right? Whether it's in healthcare, education, and so on, where you see where we actually have through data a more bottom-up kind of empowerment, and at the same time, of course, we could see the creation of new kinds of power positions, because the other slogan is, of course, information is power, still holds true, and that's where then many are still trying to hoard that kind of insight or the data. But I think it's complicated because we see trends in both directions.
That's fabulous. Okay, we have to end. Please join me in thanking our speakers.